Welcome to today's Wellbeing Livecast. So today we've got Dr. Stephen Barton, Changes and Transitions Reader. So many of you know we had a slight technical hitch last week, but we're hoping that the gods of Wi-Fi are with us this week. And so just to sort of give you a brief introduction to Stephen, because I think last time I read out the full biog, and many of you will have heard it before. But just to say, Stephen's a clinical psychologist and CBT therapist. He has a particular interest in psychotherapeutic change, and particularly for those clients who don't benefit from psychological treatments, or apparently so. He's got an interest in recurrent mood problems, and he is the co-author of a fantastic book outlining his understanding of mood disorders over his career. So it's a real distillation of some fantastic wisdom. He's head of research and development at the Newcastle Cognitive and Behavioural Therapy Centre and head of training for the Centre for Specialist Psychological Therapies. So without more ado, given it's Friday and it's 12:30, it's now time for Stephen to offer us his wisdom on changes and transitions. So I'll hand over to Stephen just now.
Well, thank you everyone for this opportunity to reflect a little bit about changes and transitions. I'll say a little bit about my aims for this talk. We're going to be about 15 minutes. I'm going to invite some reflection on the various events we've all been through in the last few months. I'm going to explore different types of change, and particularly this sort of difference between change and transition. So 4 types of change overall. And we're going to finish up with something we're going to call the change paradox. So that'll become a little bit clearer once we get downstream. What I'm hoping is that this talk will help you think about the changes you've undergone over the last few months, and to see whether or not there's some opportunities in the difficulties of this situation for new developments. And this, so what I'm going to talk about both has a kind of application collectively for the trust, for the service you work in, but it might also have a sort of individual or personal application in terms of your own personal development. So if we think back to the dim and distant past of March 2020, 3 months ago, we were all in normal life, and there's been a lot of events since then, the biggest one of course being the coronavirus pandemic. It's provoked a lot of uncertainty, a lot of inconvenience, disruption, misfortune, for some people real and fatal threat, of course. And so here we are 3 months later, June 2020. Life is not so normal for lots of us, and we're all somewhere on a kind of COVID landscape. If we think about our working lives and the disruptions there, some of us are still frontline working, but with PPEs. A lot of us are working from home. Outside the NHS, people furloughed, people with businesses that aren't trading, a number of people made redundant, so the financial strain there is quite extraordinary. If we think about the landscape of our relationships, our social life, there's of course the inconvenience of social distancing. There's also a lot of close living and some of the challenges that come with being in proximity to people where you normally are going out and coming back home. A lot of isolation, a lot of social events cancelled, and of course that can be parties and weddings and sporting events. It can also be funerals. And huge disruption to our usual fabric and rituals of our life. So at worst, a lot of loneliness. Yeah. So in terms of physical health, we know there are a lot of people still shielding at high risk of COVID. People in specific vulnerable groups, possibly not in the highest risk, but a number of people who've already had COVID-19 at home and survived it, or other illnesses, and a lot of people hospitalized, and we know of course not everyone pulling through. So we shouldn't be surprised that this is a huge challenge to our well-being, and hence these live casts, and hence why we've been thinking about how we tolerate the uncertainty, how we sleep well, how we stay socially connected, how we avoid burnout and have good work-life balance and so on. But I hope it's fair to say what comes with this situation, this landscape for all of us is a feeling vulnerable, a vulnerability, an exposure to life's uncertainties. And so if we think of this landscape, we're really talking about unwanted events. So within this landscape, I'm going to talk about 4 types of change: short-term adjustment, getting back to normal, deeper acceptance, and the 4th I'm going to talk about transitions, suggest that transitions are a little bit different. So we'll work through them and see if you identify or recognize yourself in any of these different types of change. So change 1, short-term adjustment. Here's normal life. We're pulled out of normal life into these unwanted events, and what's provoked is a lot of stress. And stress is, I think sometimes it's a word that's used quite easily or loosely, but what we really mean is demands are placed on us. A changed situation affects us and asks questions of us. Can we tolerate the uncertainty? What risks are good risks to take? How do we tolerate unmet needs? And responding to stress, we have to meet it with some kind of resilience. So this could be individual coping methods, how we tolerate and manage on our own, or it could be much more collective, that we're resilient because we belong to each other, and that's the way in which we cope with stress. So if we think June 2020, we're trying to get this balance in life, even though life is not so normal. We have stress recurrently coming at us, making demands of us, and it's easy for things to tip, to be overwhelmed, to lose balance. What we're trying to do in different ways is meet that stress with some kind of resilience, whether it's individual or collective. But the point I'd like to make is I think some of these stressors and some of our resilience has a timestamp. Some of what we're doing short term, there's a deeper challenge trying to keep this going when it's difficult to do over a longer period. So we'll move to change 2, which is the one we all want, which is getting back to normal. Here we are in normal life. We're in the stress resilience cycle. We've been living that cycle for quite a few months. And what we are desperate for is for the stress and the uncertainties and the demands to fade to a point where we can just feel the relief of getting back into normal life. And thankfully for some of us, here in June, there's a movement towards that relief into normal life. So that's good. But change 3 is deeper acceptance. And this is kind of a recognition that there's a number of people in the stress resilience cycle for whatever reason, the path back to normal life is barriered. It could be health related, it could be economic, it could be financial or social. But there's some people, for various reasons, can't get back into the normal life. In fact, some of the stressors might be increasing. Some of the resilience over time might be reducing and getting strained. So how do we get a deeper acceptance to a situation that we can't solve? Well, it's not easy, but I just wanted to share with people something I'm sure most people are familiar with: Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The idea that all human beings have needs, and some of them are quite basic around sustenance and survival. Others are more around our health and well-being and security and relationships. And the idea being if enough of our needs are met, we gradually experience a fulfillment in our lives. So this is something I've been using with my patients recently, is to try and help them connect and notice their needs. But something some of them have said is quite useful is the idea of just prioritizing more basic needs in a time like this. Attainment and fulfillment can wait till later. Let's tolerate that this isn't a time where we're likely to experience great successes and ambitions. Let's innovate around our relationships so that as far as possible, more basic needs are met. So if people don't have what they need to try and innovate, and of course, there's also a question around people realizing they've got things that they don't need, which I guess is another talk for another time. So change 4, which I sense is what we're building up to, is transitions. And again, we're back in normal life. We're pulled out of it into the unwanted events provoked by COVID. But something a number of colleagues, and I think outside of work, people are saying is that although this whole situation is, of course, frightening and terrible and difficult, there are nevertheless some unexpected benefits. In my own service, online therapy has worked better than we thought it would. There's a lot of enhanced cooperation. There's quite a bit of innovation going on around service delivery. Colleagues are working across service boundaries in ways that they haven't before. So with these benefits, there's the possibility, if you like, of creative disruption. That something we didn't want to happen, now that it's happened, what can we gain from it? Does it open up some new possibilities? So that's what the rest of the talk is about, really, this possibility of part of us wanting to get back into normal life, but another part of us recognizing that we could actually choose to move forward into some other version of our lives. And this is what we think of as transitions. It's not just an imposed or contextual change. It's something we might actually choose to change. We might decide to move from an old normal to a new normal. And I want to share with you some really interesting observations from William Bridges' book on managing transitions. And his point in this book, it's a very popular one in North America, and it's really about organizational changes, is that, you know, most changes are imposed or situational, they're outside in, whereas transitions are developmental. And if we really want to transform ourselves or our services, our teams, how we work together, we're going to have to see it as a developmental process, not just a nominal or situational process. So transitions are developmental. And I'm going to say a little bit about what the wisdom Bridges shares around this. So first of all, if there's an old normal that we're transitioning out of, how do we move out of it? And he's got this lovely quote: just because everything is different around here doesn't mean anything has changed. So I think we can all identify this, that just announcing big changes doesn't mean they're going to happen. And he says something very interesting, which is, rather than pretending big change isn't happening, rather than sort of pretending and hoping people don't notice, you're much better in organizations to begin with endings. To have a ritual, to have a letting go, to make it explicit that certain things from the past that people are maybe still attached to is something that's worth letting go. And what he says is, when organizations allow this process, what they can look out for is the subjective losses, the loss behind the loss. So rather than thinking about staff as resistant or refuseniks, let's actually try and understand what it is they're holding on to and why they're holding on to it. That might make it easier for them to let go of it if they should, really. So how to move through transitions. Another lovely quote: we fear transitions the most like being between trapezes. It's just such a sort of vivid image of being midair, not really sure if the future is going to catch you, really. It's sometimes called a liminal space, and nowhere between two somewheres. And so Bridges talks about this as a phase where we have repatterning, where there's an opportunity to repattern our structures and our lives and our services. He says it's uncomfortable, it's uncertain, but it can also be creative and innovative. We shouldn't be surprised in these transitions where there's forces between us and in us pulling back to the past, but there's also people and parts within us driving and pushing us forward into something else. And that it's a normal thing for there to be a tussle, to acknowledge the tussle that goes on, really. What he recommends is fairly common sense, but that doesn't, of course, mean we do it, which is to really try and strengthen intergroup connections during transitions, really create the opportunity for communication. We're trying to get everyone on board. We're trying to understand why they want to keep the past the way it was, and try to get alignment and collective agreement around where we're heading in our services. But he also says it's so important to embrace difference, to not do this as a kind of an exercise in uniformity, but to allow people the opportunity to voice difference and different points of view. Lovely quote from Walter Lippmann: "When all think alike, no one thinks very much." So allow the difference and diversity to come through. So in this process and how we land in the new normal, there's a paradox really, which I find really interesting around this deeper change. And the paradox runs something like this. So first of all, we spend a lot of our lives trying to avoid unwanted events. Of course, we never quite manage it. They'll always keep happening. But we need enough of these unwanted events to actually build the resilience. If you think earlier about short-term adjustment rather, you know, we have to meet stress with resilience. We need to have enough resilience to do it. We need to grow it and develop it. But there's a further aspect of this paradox. We also need unwanted events to find the courage to transition. And I'm going to unpack this and say a little bit more about it. So first of all, transitions take courage. We're tolerating uncertainty. We're trying to communicate. We're between trapezes. We're repatterning. We're trying to get everyone on board. We're trying to notice the losses behind the loss. This is not easy or simple. It's a courageous process. And drawing a little bit on some of Brené Brown's work, which I commend to you as well, I think it's so easy for us to think courage is over here and it's about strength and determination, and over some other place we've got weakness and you know, feebleness and so on, and vulnerability. And what she says is that this really is codswallop, that we actually need vulnerability and weakness, because that's where courage grows from. You can't be brave if you're not frightened. And so I commend her work to you to think about the importance of finding strength and courage from being vulnerable, not from avoiding it, really. And then we're back to the earlier observation, which is vulnerability comes from unwanted events. Let's think back to the COVID landscape. How many of us, honestly, in the last 3 months have not felt vulnerable? Our vulnerability is what we're sharing at the moment. It might manifest in all sorts of different ways. But if we put this all together, even though COVID is the most unwanted event, no one would vote for COVID. It's provoking huge suffering and tragedy. But nevertheless, because transitions take courage, because courage comes from feeling vulnerable, and that vulnerability usually comes from us sitting in unwanted events, we nevertheless have to, I think, accept that we need unwanted events in our lives and in our working lives, firstly to build resilience, but also to find the courage to transition into some new possibilities and new normals. So I hope this has been interesting or useful for you, whether it's for you more a professional issue around organisational change, or where we're thinking more about our own personal development. I hope you've maybe identified yourself in some of these processes, and I look forward to having an opportunity to discuss some of these issues with you in the future. Thank you very much.